Story that's been dominating the news over the past few days. Let me show you this headline. In the BBC presenter row, Director General Tim Davie likely to face questions. Yes, the story of a high-profile BBC presenter accused of paying for explicit pictures continues to be on most of the front pages. Today, Tim Davie, the Director General, faces the press for the first time since the allegations came to light in a pre-scheduled event that's actually for the publication of the corporation's annual report. Now, the Sun story is now one of claim and counterclaim after the lawyer representing the young person involved says nothing unlawful took place in the original allegations are rubbish, but the parents of the young person say they acted to protect their vulnerable child. Now, there is a lot that we don't know, but the BBC finds itself at the centre of another media storm and questions about whether it has acted adequately. So my opening question to the panel is, what damage, if any, has been done to the BBC?
Well, first of all, if there's any acts of criminality, that clearly has to be a police matter, and we should leave it to the police to investigate. Clearly, if there's been inappropriate behaviour, then there's clearly an issue for the BBC. And just as a wider observation I would make, I think we've got to be very careful about what is happening here, because we've got a young person, aged 20, they've got their whole life ahead. We do not want to see that damaged. And we have somebody who has a career that could be completely destroyed. So we've got to be aware of the sort of personal elements that are going on in the background. But more fundamentally, the BBC is an institution. It's a major institution. It clearly has responsibilities. It clearly has to have procedures that are in place that deal with situations like this. Have they acted adequately? Well, I think that will come out in due course. Right,
you haven't made your mind up in that regard. Emma, what about you? What damage has been done to the BBC?
Well, I actually agree with John. We need to be really careful when discussing this and talking about it. In terms of the damage to the BBC, I think the BBC needs to show that it's acted properly. There's question marks over has it acted swiftly, how much communication has been made with the young person involved and the parents involved, have they been adequately informed of the processes? I mean, I used to be a primary school teacher, so safeguarding of young people has always been at the utmost importance to me myself. Has that been followed with the BBC? We'll only know, as John says, in due course. But I do think we need to be really careful when talking about this. Potentially, this is about a young person's future and somebody's career. So we need to be mindful of that.
I mean, in terms of damage that has or hasn't been done to the BBC as an institution, what do you make of the fact that the BBC itself is yet again under a certain amount of scrutiny?
Well, I just think it's so depressing to see, once again, how this has become an opportunity for many on the right to have a go at the BBC. It's become a political football once again. And so you've got Lee Anderson, the deputy chair of the Tory party, saying that the BBC, I think he said, is something like his home for perverts.
Safe haven for perverts.
Safe haven for perverts, that's all right. You've also got right-wing Tories basically saying this is an excuse again now to look again at the issues around the licence fee. And the bottom line is we just simply don't know. Your initial question was how much damage has this done to the BBC? We don't know. And I would just love us to end this feeding frenzy for the reasons that both John and Emma have set out. There are real people's real lives at stake. Can we just park that, let the police do their investigation if that's what they're going to do, let the BBC do theirs, and then come back to it when we know the facts? Because this kind of claim and counterclaim every hour of every day right now, I think is just such a distraction from some very big issues that we ought to be discussing.
Absolutely.
I think that everyone on this panel has been very measured, but the problem is I think there is an influential body of opinion in the Conservative Party, some of John's colleagues, who will seize on any opportunity to bash the BBC. But there are also, of course, valid questions and a legitimate political debate over how the BBC is funded in future. So the risk for the BBC here is whatever happens, whatever the outcome of this clearly contested and very sensitive case, if indeed the unnamed presenter is this is proven to be a storm in a teacup or unsubstantiated or whatever. Clearly, the BBC will face questions for how it's dealt with this internal personnel issue. But if these allegations are substantiated, then the questions of what the BBC knew and when and whether they acted adequately will also come back to bite them. And you can see critics of the BBC, of which there are many in Parliament, and this is a live issue.
But we should separate the two issues. There is the issues about what's actually happened here, and I think we've got to try and take it out the limelight in many respects, get it properly investigated, look at what the issues are and come to a conclusion about that and deal with the consequences that flow from that. Then there is the wider issue as to the direction of travel for the BBC, its role in our society, how we fund it, etc., etc. Now, I think that's entirely legitimate debate. My party's got different views within it, as will other parties, but I think that's an entirely legitimate debate and that's one we should be having.
But do you think some of your colleagues have conflated those two issues in this?
Well, I'd like to think not, because I just do think that they are.
Otherwise,
I'd like to think not, because we have two very separate issues going on here, and I think there is a completely legitimate debate about the direction of the travel of.
Would you call on some of your colleagues who've been more outspoken about the other issues, whether it's the licence fee or anything else? Should they be restrained in the way that you have been in this?
Well, I'm speaking personally. I think when it comes to issues dealing with people's lives, and we don't know all the circumstances, we do not know all the facts, we should separate that and allow the correct procedures to take place. If there's criminality involved, which we do not know, the police clearly need to be involved.
All right.
If it's about the administration of the response from the BBC, then that needs to be dealt with as well.
It also raises this question that is in the headline in the Daily Mail. 1 in 6 people know who scandal hit BBC star is. It raises the questions about privacy, and there are quite stringent laws about privacy, but it is very different online, and this has been highlighted in terms of the sort of Wild West, if you like, of social media. Is it impossible to really keep to those sorts of privacy laws, Patrick?
Well, I think the problem with UK privacy law now is that since Cliff Richard and since the Bloomberg Supreme Court case against an unnamed businessman who successfully sued and prevented himself being named because of a fraud investigation, you've got a real, quite corrosive mismatch between media organisations being unable to print basically anything, even when the evidence is very strong because the privacy laws are very restrictive, which creates a massive vacuum that is almost immediately filled by social media, much of which, or in some cases almost all of which, is unsubstantiated and wrong. So clearly there needs to be some sort of correction here, and it's no wonder we're now in a situation where cabinet ministers are having to say, please don't name who this may or may not be under parliamentary privilege. But you can see if you're an MP who cares deeply about press freedom or maybe has a misguided desire to make a name for oneself, that the parliamentary privilege option would be quite attractive in this case and others like it.
Right, and it has been done before, of course. Some MPs have taken it upon themselves to do exactly that, and not always with positive outcomes. Do you agree? There is a mismatch here. I mean, it's very difficult with online being able to do and say things with impunity that you wouldn't be able to otherwise.
I think it's,
No, just to say, I do think it is much harder with the role of social media, but we need to be looking at, this online harms bill, which we've been waiting for how long have we been waiting for it now? But these are the kinds of things we need to be looking at addressing, people's reputation, people's future, people's careers. And the fact that we had a number of BBC stars coming out having to say, look, this is not me, shows the damage that these rumours can do when innocent people are seeing accusations about themselves throughout social media.
But the online harms bill won't necessarily tackle this anyway, would it?
I think there's a wider issue here. It's about the dilemma that we have between the freedom of the press and a degree of privacy that we all should be entitled to. And it's where that balance lies. And I think that's an enormous challenge with the arrival of social media. And how we address that, I think, is going to be very challenging for future politicians.
Right, although it's been around for quite some time. Let's have a look at this headline and move on. Decriminalise drugs, the Times headline says, for personal use, says SNP. But the power to decriminalise drugs lies with Westminster and not the Scottish Government. It's what we call a reserved power. And the UK government has so far said no to the SNP's proposals. Well, let's talk to Elena Whittam, the SNP's drugs minister. Hello to you, Elena. Why do you think decriminalisation is the way to go?
I think if we think about what the viewer said at the outset of the programme in the Vox Pop, the war on drugs has actually failed. And in Scotland, we are facing a public health emergency. And I think if you think about numbers of harms that are rising across the rest of the UK, this is something that no one can be complacent on. The Reserved Misuse of Drugs Act is over 50 years old and is woefully out of date. And in order for me and Scotland to actually have that public health approach, we need those legislations to be brought up to date. So that is what my evidence-based policy paper actually sets out, is how we actually take a view that actually reduces the stigma. Criminalisation actually brings a lot of stigma to people and pushes people further away from services.
And people might say to you, Elena, that Scotland, as you have alluded to, continues continues to have the highest drug death rate recorded by any country in Europe. With those sort of statistics, and you've had a decade to deal with it, why should people listen to you about your approach?
I think it's really clear to understand that we've actually got a £250 million national mission to improve and save lives when it comes to drugs deaths and drugs-related harm. But at this point in time, we're operating with one hand tied behind our back because our public health approach cannot be fully embedded within the current laws that exist at the moment. And I think we need to recognise that, you know, while Scotland faces a huge challenge to climb, the rest of the UK is, you know, seeing drugs-related deaths increase exponentially. And we're also facing the increased risk coming from synthetic opioids. And I think all of us have to work collectively across these islands to actually face down that real and immediate danger that's incoming.
What's the justification, John, for saying no to the SNP on this?
Well, I think there's a lot of politics going on here because the drug policy in Scotland has been pretty poor over the last few years, very sadly. But I think at the end of the day, we are one country, the United Kingdom. Our policy and our laws should be consistent when it comes to this issue. A personal view, I don't think we should decriminalise.
Why?
Well, I think if I'm taking a drug that I'm entitled to legally to do, but I'm acquiring it from or buying it from Emma, who's doing something illegal, I think that starts to legitimise the whole process. And I just do not think that is the right approach that we should be taking. I think we should have a consistent policy right across the United Kingdom.
Elena?
I think that we have to recognise that there's places within this world that operate at different policies in different places. If we think about Canada, if we think about the United States, they actually have different drugs laws within different provinces and within different states. So there's no reason to say that we cannot act differently. But I think what is failed to be recognised here is there's a threat that's actually across the entirety of the UK at the moment. And simply criminalising people, adding to the stigma and pushing people further away from services is definitely not the answer. And what I'm proposing is actually evidence-based. It's backed by, the common policy position that all 31 chief executives of all the UN agencies have had since 2018. This is not something new, but this is something that we need, and we need to work together on it.
Emma, do you agree with Elena? It should be allowed now for the SNP to take a different approach. Would a Labour government support it?
Well, I have to say I don't support the decriminalisation of drugs, and the reason why is because it's not a victimless crime. And I tell you what really made me think about this seriously was I was invited by the police to go and witness, where they'd been growing cannabis. A cannabis farm had been set up in my constituency. And I went in, I saw this farm, very sort of sophisticated operation that it was working there. And what I also saw was a mattress on the floor. I saw evidence of somebody living in squalor. And what the police told me is that modern day slavery is involved in the growing of cannabis, that people are locked into these farms and they are forced to work in them and they're having to live amongst these fumes. And this is an example of modern day slavery. So no, I do not support the decriminalisation of this. It is not a victimless crime. It is linked to modern day slavery. And I think we should relentlessly go after the people who are pushing this. But at the same time, we should relentlessly support the people who are in need by proper investment in rehab services.
Elena, you don't seem to be able to convince either of our politicians here. Do you think you're not going to be able to do this, are you?
I think it's really unfortunate that, politicians can at times revert to a position that's not founded in the evidence that's before us. Decriminalisation is not the same as legalisation. And it's also really important that we make sure that people feel comfortable in order to come forward. And as long as people are pushed towards the margins, they're not going to feel as if they actually can come forward to get that support that they need. I absolutely do agree that we need to make sure that we still go after serious and organised crime and go after for those people who are doing human trafficking. But that does not mean that we need to needlessly criminalise a section of our society who are actually experiencing a health issue and not a criminal justice one.
And when I said the politicians, of course, we have Caroline here to Green MP, who has a different view and agrees much more with Elena.
I do agree with Elena, and actually coming back to what Emma said, it's precisely because it's not a victimless crime that I believe that we should take it out of criminal hands. And I believe that if you were to do the policy around decriminalisation as a first step towards a wider policy of regulation, we would actually have a chance of getting this evil trade really out of the hands of the criminals, which is what makes it evil, and have it where, as Elena said, drug misuse or use is a health issue, not a criminal justice one. If you had it regulated, then you would treat drugs in the same way as we treat alcohol and tobacco. Because right now, young people speak to me and they tell me it is far easier for them to get hold of drugs than it is for them to get hold of alcohol. They just make one phone call and they know who to call. No one asks them how old they are. No one asks them anything else. So I think we need to move towards a regulated scheme. And that is exactly, as Elena said, what the evidence points to. It's not just the evidence from the UN, although Elena rightly points to that. It's the evidence of so many police officers, so many Home Secretaries, actually, once they leave office, they admit that this is what we should be doing, and yet there's this kind of right-wing fear of being able to, and the fear of the right-wing press.
It's not right-wing. I mean, Emma is on the Labour Party, or not just right-wing, let's put it that way.
But Labour, I'm afraid, is also worrying about right-wing press. And if we could actually have a proper debate about how to protect people from harm, the evidence points to the fact that a regulated system is the best way of protecting people from harm and being able to ensure that people
you brought up the whole spectrum of regulation. That is Green Party policy. I'll show you this headline. This is the police seize £130 million worth of cannabis in UK-wide crackdown. The officer in charge of that operation, Steve Jupp, said this.
Cannabis cultivation is part of a whole network of criminality. It doesn't sit there singly. And so that we looked specifically at cannabis cultivation this time round to see how the criminal activities that fall out of that, both financially and also through linking into other criminal gangs, were operating in the UK. We also know, and we listen to what our communities are telling us, and we know that our communities are concerned about the amount of cannabis grows there are in the UK, and also the amount of violence that is undertaken by gangs in terms of trying to deal with each other's cannabis grow activity.
Patrick, most people would say that the war on drugs has failed by whatever metric you want to choose, and they want to improve it. Why won't the Conservatives or the Labour Party actually look at some of the possible approaches being put forward by Caroline and Elena?
Well, because, look, crime is a very salient issue electorally, and the reason there is consensus on that side of the panel is that the Labour Party does not want to be perceived as soft on crime.
But it's also because we actually believe, and I actually personally believed, it is not a victimless crime. It is linked to modern-day slavery. It is linked to trafficking. It is linked to abuse. And I think, as I've said before, you know, we cannot look at this as being some innocent sort of pastime.
I don't think it's innocent for a second, which is exactly why you need to take it away from the underground
and this is why we also need to be
dealing in it.
And where I think Caroline and I will agree, I'm sure, is we do need that relentless focus on rehabilitation and support. And we've seen massive cuts. Massive cuts.
Well, let Caroline come back in on this.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that Emma can't sit there and say this is not a victimless crime and then not follow through the logic of what she's saying, because it's precisely by keeping drugs in the hands of gangs that actually drives more victims. It means that the drug gangs are more linked to other kinds of crime.
Absolutely,
it means it's much more likely that people that we all want to help are going to come forward to get help because they know they're going to be criminalised if they do.
I interrupted you to begin with.
But clearly the realm of what's politically possible, this debate has come a long way since New Labour was downgrading the classification of some drugs, and Professor Nutt was saying that ecstasy was safer than horse riding, right? We're now, the realm of what's politically possible on drugs policy in this country has shrunk, and there's no better illustration of that as Anas Sarwar was in favour of a similar policy to what the SNP have just announced, and when the SNP announced this last week, he was on a visit with Rachel Reeves, and both of them said, absolutely not.
Which is downright cowardly, because there are lives at risk, to be honest.
But I'm not the wider community.
And this is going to make it more likely for
decriminalisation either.
Well, hang on. I mean, there is a political consensus here at the moment, but it is interesting. Patrick says, what's politically possible? Is that it? Do you privately think something else? Emma says she doesn't.
No, I think you've got to look at, you know, we are representatives. We represent our communities, and they have their views on drug policy as well. And I think there's a strong consensus in this country that we should not be decriminalising.
That's because we never have the proper debate, because it always gets portrayed as if we're suggesting that people go to sweet shops and sell drugs.
You can have a sensible, mature debate about these issues, and you can still come to the conclusion that you do not think that it is.
But what we do need to talk about, and I think this is where, you know, you're saying there's, you know, consensus on this side, but I think where there is the big dividing line is the amount of support that should be there. I see it in my own constituency. I've been to Renew. I've talked to them about the difficulties they have supporting people. I've talk to people who are currently suffering because they have addiction problems. I see the blight that this impacts on the community. And this is why I think, as I've said, yes, no, I don't think we should decriminalise it, but I do think we should absolutely be out there supporting people. We should be involved in drug education. We should be helping communities. And at the same time, we should be going after these people who, as I say, it will stay with me forever, that image of that mattress on the floor, that person living in squalor, forced to tend these plants. These are organised criminal gangs.
A regulated system. A regulated system gets away from drugs being in the hands of the gangs and of the criminals. That is exactly why, if you care about the person on the mattress, as I'm sure you do, at least could we open our eyes to the possibility of looking at something that might work better? Because we know that the current policy doesn't work. The Misuse of Drugs Act is now over 50 years old. One of the things I've been pressing for ever since I was elected, because when I was first elected, Brighton was the drugs death capital of the UK. I'm very glad it's not right now. But what I was pressing for then and still press for would be at the very least a review of the Misuse of Drugs Act. Look at whether or not it's worked. Look at the evidence from other countries, from Portugal to Canada, who are taking a different approach and who have a much better record of reducing harm.
Elena, I'm just going to get a final word from you. What will you do now as the SNP if, as looks likely, the government continues to say no to decriminalisation and no to drug consumption rooms?
I think, just before I go on to that, I think we have to recognise there's been a false dichotomy put forward here. This is not one thing or the other. This is actually bringing our drug laws into the 21st century so we can actually have a public health approach. So we can deliver all those harm reduction measures that we need, including safer injection facilities, including drug checking facilities. And by doing that, we actually empower people to look after their own health, and we make sure that we're responding adequately. I really would impress upon the Prime Minister and also those in the UK opposition parties to work constructively with me on this. Have a look at the evidence paper that I have presented, because it's not going to help anybody at any place in these islands if we do not actually work with urgency on this. And I will continue to work towards the national mission that backed up with £250 million to make sure that people can get access to the treatment that works for them. But this will be made easier if the government in the UK works with me.
Elena Whittam from the SNP, thank you very much. Let me bring you this bit of breaking news. We said at the beginning of the programme that the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, was facing journalists for the first time since the story about a high-profile presenter broke several days ago. He has said and told journalists that the presenter at the centre of recent allegations wasn't spoken to until the 6th of July, which is the day the Sun newspaper put its story to the BBC. He confirmed we did receive a call on the 19th of May. That was taken by the Audiences Services team, who then make a summary of the call. It did not include an allegation of criminality, but was very serious. At this press briefing, which is related, as I said, to the BBC's annual report, he confirmed he's asked for a review, which will be internal, of how things are what we call red flagged for their importance. He said any affair of this nature is serious. Trust is absolutely fundamental to the BBC, and it's too early to say how this will impact the organisation in terms of trust. He went on to say we need to run a fair process. It's complex and very fast-moving, and we need to balance duty of care, get across the legal issues in terms of privacy and public interest. So that is the latest from the BBC Director General, Tim Davie. Let's talk about climate. This is the headline in Reuters. Antarctic ice levels undergo massive decrease, data shows. They plummeted to 17% below the average during the world's hottest June on record. And scientists are describing this as unprecedented. There's been a lot of debate around the response from both the government and the opposition. The Climate Change Committee have criticised the government for being too slow to act in a scathing report that calls for radical reform, particularly for continuing to approve fossil fuel projects. Do you accept that criticism, John?
I think we've got to be practical and sensible going forward. We've got to start to look to what we can do to expand, in my view, things like nuclear power, continue with the renewable...
Yeah, but that's going to take time, as you know.
But it will take time, and we've got to be realistic and practical. But we need to move more quickly. I fully accept that. But we have to accept that you're going to have oil, you're going to have gas for many years to come.
Why?
That is,
Why do you have to accept that?
Well, that is the reality of life. Because we
not according to the Climate Change Committee. They're saying you shouldn't be continuing to approve fossil fuel projects. New coal mine and oil and gas projects being given the go-ahead.
But we have to accept that you can't just suddenly overnight change our whole energy system, our whole transport system. It's going to take time. But we have to go down that route. We're already doing a lot of work, and we have done over the last 10 to 12 years in terms of renewables, and we are continuing to do that. I had a nuclear conference just a week ago talking about SMRs and the production of those and how we can bring those on stream. But they, again, do take time to construct, to build and to bring on. So it does take time, but there's nothing wrong with having an ambitious policy to get us to net zero.
Even though it's been criticised. Of course, Labour are on the same page when it comes to oil and gas projects because although Keir Starmer has said he wouldn't approve oil and gas projects, it wouldn't be until a Labour government was in place. So anything that's approved now, you're signed up to.
I think it's perfectly normal for a Labour government or a future Labour government to say they'll be responsible for what a future Labour government does and not what a previous government does. And if I may, actually, which might be unusual for this panel, just quickly pay tribute to Caroline, who is standing down as a Member of Parliament at the end of this term, for her work on the environment and for her campaigning on this issue. And I'm sure if we do have a future Labour government,
even though you've ignored it,
she will hold our feet to the fire.
Just on that very point, actually, interesting. I know Caroline, I'm sure, will criticise some of the things I've just said, but interestingly, we are very much on the same page when it comes to solar panels in our belief that actually they should have been made compulsory.
With all that flattery that's obviously softening you up, Caroline.
Sometimes it's nice to be nice, but no, in terms of what a future Labour government would do, of course, your future Labour government cannot be held responsible for decisions made under a consensus.
You can give a very firm signal as to what a Labour government will be doing.
Our very firm signal is we will not approve any new ones from the date of, hopefully, a future Labour government.
Well, there you go. I mean, also practical. John said this is a practical, sensible approach. Emma is saying that a new Labour government, if it wins the next election, will not approve any future oil and gas licences. Surely that is the way to keep the lights on and transition to a green economy.
We've got enough oil and gas already known about that we're already extracting, which will keep the lights on for a very long time, for several decades. So the question here is whether or not we should be opening up new oil and gas wells. And what makes me depressed about what Emma has said and what the Labour Party position is if they were to come out right now and say no to Rosebank. Rosebank is the biggest undeveloped North Sea oil field in the North Sea. That would, if Labour were to say it wouldn't go ahead with that, that would absolutely freeze the idea of the investment going ahead right now. So Labour has it in their power to stop Rosebank. Rosebank alone would create the same number of emissions as the 28 lowest income countries in the world. And it would cost taxpayers over £3 billion because of the absolutely ridiculous, and I don't know if John might agree with me on this one, but we have a ridiculous set of subsidies and fossil fuel kickbacks to the oil companies under this government. So, first of all, Labour could stop Rosebank if it chose to, and I think it's wrong that it doesn't. Secondly, can I just come back to John, because once again, in spite of his kind words about solar panels where we do agree, the issue around oil and gas is getting polarised, because John said, you know, we can't turn off oil and gas overnight. Nobody, not even Just Stop Oil, is talking about turning off oil and gas overnight. What we're talking about are the new explorations for oil and gas, and that is what the Committee on Climate Change says is not compatible with our climate change objectives. That is what the International Energy Agency says we must not do if we're serious about climate change.
Well, Emma, do you want to respond? She's very disappointed in you.
Well, I kind of also take it as a slightly backhanded compliment that Caroline is assuming there will be a future Labour government which would have the power to stop
the answer to the question.
So I think I'll take that as yes, you know, when if we have that future Labour government. I think what Labour will also announced, and in fact the last time I was on, it's my favourite ever policy, is the GB energy policy about green energy by 2030. It is my favourite, and I mentioned it last time because it is. It's reindustrialisation, it's looking at all of that green energy opportunities. But I also just want to say, if you don't mind, we need to be thinking about flooding as well. And so we talk often about climate in relation to energy. We also need to start talking about flood resilience and flood mitigation. So this issue of climate isn't just an energy issue. We need to be looking out how we build our homes, where we build them, the mitigation measures in place. This has to be almost, if we're going to seriously talk about climate, it has to be across all the different departments and address it in finance, address it in energy, address it in home building.
Well, let's take the spirit of your outlining support in every sort of area of climate change policy, except it seems when it comes to the ultra-low emission zone that the Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan is suggesting is expanded. Now, there are Tory councils in outer London boroughs that are against it, but so is Keir Starmer, so is the candidate standing in Uxbridge in the forthcoming by-election. If you really were in favour of climate change policies, why aren't you backing the Labour Mayor?
Well, I mean, obviously, I have no impact on the Labour Mayor's decisions or not. And if
Danny has a view, don't you? Is he right with the ultra-low emission zone, or isn't he? Keir Starmer hasn't actually endorsed either position.
Well, that is a decision for the Mayor to make. That's not a decision as a Member of Parliament.
So you agree with climate change policies, but not when it comes to air pollution?
No, that's not true at all. And that's a slightly unfair summary.
Why is it unfair?
I agree with climate change policies. I agree. Just yesterday, I stood up in the House and I spoke about flood mitigation and protection measures for house building plans. And I'm talking about Labour's target to build all of these homes, how we ensure those homes are climate resilient, how we ensure they're fit for the future. I represent Hull, which is the second most floodplain city in the whole of the country. Flooding is a massive issue, and so obviously I'm keen to talk about flooding. I'm not a Member of Parliament for London.
But the thing is, this is votes, isn't it? And politics coming before policies, and perhaps it reflects the reality of what's going on here.
Not for the first time, you're seeing parties' electoral incentives cut across what they may or may not have thought at some point to be good policy. The prime example, you mentioned the ULEZ, right? In recent weeks, Labour has downgraded its commitment to spend £28 billion a year on climate technology. And why is that? Because any incoming government is going to have a challenging fiscal situation. And what does the Labour Party think is more important than green issues? Well, signalling that they're going to be responsible with the public finances. And I don't think any party has found a way to reconcile that very short-termist electoral messaging and the perhaps longer-term strategic questions.
I mean, that is the case for the Conservatives. Yeah, I mean, Zach Goldsmith, who has departed from the government as Environment Minister, has said what perhaps is the truth, that Rishi Sunak's just not interested, is not really interested in the environment because cost of living is more important.
Well, I think you're starting to see a change in policy, for example, on nuclear. And I think nuclear is going to be a significant part of the future and our ambitions to get to net zero. And I think there's been a change in attitude, particularly with regards to the private sector and how we invest in nuclear. Nuclear has many different advantages for our country. For example, it gives energy security, because you obviously have the plants in this country. You have a base supply, which helps the renewable element. But there is also things about skills, there's about employment, and there's about economic development, particularly in parts of the north. If you were to take, for example, Cumbria, if we were to have 2 or 3 SMRs built there, the impact on the area would be hugely significant in the supply chain, in the job prospects, and also it takes us towards the
short term, though. There's absolutely nothing that nuclear is going to help us with when it comes to the short term. Plus, it is massively expensive.
Well, that's an interesting point about expensive. I'll take you up on that. No, because the private sector have got a completely different attitude.
Well, I mean,
but the private sector have a completely different attitude now to nuclear, because the SMR, building these huge nuclear plants, 20 billion plus, the risk is enormous.
They're using that funding model, which means that the taxpayer is actually putting in a huge amount of money.
I know, they're not. That is, again, incorrect. A lot of private sector are now willing to invest in SMRs because the risk to them is much, much reduced.
Why haven't they?
Well, they're starting to. What they're looking to is a lead from government in terms of the regulatory aspects. In Cumbria, there is a company there that wants to build an SMR at Sellafield.
Yeah, what is an SMR?
It's a small modular reactor. Sorry. It's a small modular reactor. Basically, it's a small nuclear...
But not very small. Right, but actually, let's just take Caroline's point. But hang on, it is, but let's just take the point that is still more long-term. The problem, Caroline, is that we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Exactly. You are asking people, you're asking voters to effectively pay more, perhaps in the short term, and politicians know people don't want to do it. They can't afford to do it.
Can I just remind you that when David Cameron said, let's get rid of the green crap, what that actually led to was £150 more on everybody's bills, on their energy bills, precisely because we weren't investing in the house-to-house home insulation programme that we desperately need.
And so that's got nowhere.
It's exactly why this false dichotomy between dealing with climate on the one hand and dealing with the cost of living on the other is not a genuine division. It's precisely because people are so strapped for cash that we need to be investing to make sure that their energy bills come down.
And how-
the government is in the position to do that. You're going to ask me where to get the money from. OK, so why don't we have a debate on this panel about a wealth tax? We never talk about a wealth tax.
No, we do. It's raised all the time, but nobody takes it on.
Well, the Greens would, so give us the chance. Emma, move over and give us the
I mean, in a way,
Another short-term
investment.
electoral question, but you're not going to get this Labour Party leadership come out and talk about wealth taxes,
Right.
Which is part of the problem.
Which is depressing, isn't it? I
But
mean,
it also-
basically, you've got
We need to-
Labour and Tory
Caroline,
becoming interchangeable.
isn't
No,
part of the-
that's
hang on.
really
Let
unfair,
Patrick
that's not
ask.
accurate.
Let
That's not
Patrick ask.
accurate.
I'll come back to you in a
Isn't
minute.
part of the problem that for years and years and years, people with your politics or broadly aligned to you politically have said about stuff like nuclear, it would take really long and it would be really expensive. Nick Clegg said as much in the early years of the coalition government. Now we could have had nuclear power coming on stream. Is that not a problem? Is there any part of you that regrets sort of that stance now when we're in the middle of an energy crisis?
I think I'm making the case more about time now than I was then. There are plenty of other reasons to be against nuclear then, but the issue about time now is that the government has a decarbonisation target of getting rid of carbon in the electricity system by 2035. These SMRs of John's, and indeed any bigger nuclear power stations, are hardly going to even be on stream by 2035, so they are not going to be able to help us
Again, that's incorrect.
decarbonise
SMRs could be on
electric.
Stop saying SMRs.
But you're incorrect on the timescale. They can be brought on stream well before
Let's
that.
see, I'll give you a
All
bet.
right.
And what we
All right.
also
All right.
do with
Well,
that-
we can make a bet. You can agree it outside the studio. Just very briefly before we leave it, as the others have said, you are going to be stepping down. Do you think you've made enough impact on this issue?
No, of course not. I mean, I wish I'd been able to make more. It's really hard as a single MP out of 650, but the Greens do make a difference when they're in the room. There are certainly issues on the agenda that wouldn't have been there if I hadn't have been there. There are certainly ways in which you can see that the debate has advanced. So I'm never going to say it's enough. But has it made a difference? I hope so.
Let's talk about the illegal migration bill that the government is desperately trying to push through Parliament. But let's start with some of the figures. I think we can show you the story in the BBC website. Channel Migrants. More than 1,300 people cross in 3 days. That's according to the government figures. And on Friday, 686 people made the journey from France, and that is the highest daily figure so far this year. What do you make of those numbers, John?
They are very large numbers and they are unsustainable over the future. And that is why the government's got to address this issue. Part of the solution is obviously the bill that is going through Parliament, but I think more work needs to be done ultimately with our neighbours in France. I think ultimately, you've got to strike some sort of agreement or understanding with the French that somehow we reduce the numbers.
Because are you not a supporter of the Rwanda policy?
I support the government's legislation because I think we've got to ultimately do something. And if you look at my constituency...
So anything, anything.
That is part of their solution. That is one element to it. Obviously, the discussions that they have with France is another element to it. But I look at my constituency. We have 2 hotels in the area. Is that the right use of the hotels? Clearly not. Is that good for the community? It certainly isn't.
Right.
We've got to expand and improve the process of how we process people who have come here.
Well, you've
to make
had
sure
13 years to obviously do that.
and that is starting to change and improve, and there's still more work
What
to
in
be
the
done.
bill specifically will bring numbers down, if that's what you want to see?
Well, I mean, there are... Well, we'll have to wait and see if the bill does ultimately go through.
No, but
and
I'm asking, you know what's in the bill. What in the bill specifically is going to bring those
Well,
numbers down?
there is the possibility that of the Rwanda concept, that if people
in the
were...
courts, of course, at the moment.
It is, and we'll have to wait and see the outcome of that. That is part of it. But I think more fundamentally, and this is a view I have, is that the agreement with the French is critical to it.
Right.
Because I think if we come to some sort of better understanding with them and we curtail the boats, I think that is better for us, better for the French.
Sure.
And more importantly, it does get rid of the gangsters and the organisations that are bringing people across and getting an awful lot of money which they shouldn't.
Well, we'll come to France in just a moment, but let's have a look at this. Ken Clarke, not a known hardliner on this issue, former Conservative cabinet minister, says, I'm not known for being tough on immigration, but we must give the Rwanda plan a chance. Despite protestations, no one has put forward an alternative to the Prime Minister's scheme. We can no longer simply do nothing. And this is obviously processing asylum claims of people who arrive here in Rwanda for them to stay in Rwanda. What do you make of what Ken Clarke is saying? He says you haven't put forward an alternative. No one
Well,
has.
we have put forward an alternative. We have a 5-point plan for dealing with it. But I am utterly opposed to this piece of legislation. It is not going to work. It is going to cost around £6 billion.
But Labour
That's
have
the
offered
Home
no
Office.
alternative
We have a
solutions.
5-point plan. I'm happy to quickly go through it. It's going to cost £6 million. Even if, and I said this last time I was on, even if the Rwanda plan was successful and people were able to send them there, you're talking 1 to 2% of the entire population who are waiting for asylum decisions. The asylum seeker backlog is now at 170.
But the government is dealing with that.
No, they're not. The
No,
170,000.
the government said they put money in and they started to deal with it. So
No,
you
they
would do the
haven't.
same?
No, they
Well,
haven't.
look at the
Only
success we've had with the
1%
Albanian
of
policy.
last year,
I just don't think Labour have any
last year, in terms of all the number of people crossing in the small boats, only 1% of those people have been processed. As an individual constituency MP, people come to me all the time about problems with the Home Office and how incompetent it is. And I've said this before on here, the Home Office is not fit for purpose. It is not working. This plan is going to cost £6 billion during the cost of living crisis. It's only going to impact 1 to 2% of the entire 170,000 people backlog waiting for decisions.
We have to reduce the
Hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. Others need to talk. We haven't got that much. John, you respond, and then I'm going to come over to Patrick.
I'm just making the simple observation. We cannot sustain the number of people that are coming across in the boats. So we actually have to have policies that do something.
Of course we do. And the Labour Party have our 5-point plan.
I do not see
Well, we
Labour
have, and
having
I'll
offered
quickly
any
go through it.
No,
We would
no,
use
Emma,
the
because we
money-
know what the plan is. In fact, I'm going to get Patrick
very
to
well,
summarise a bit. But some of the things that Labour is suggesting in that 5-point plan, the government is now belatedly taking on. When it comes to this bill and the concessions that are being made, when it comes to mothers and children, is that going to persuade enough Conservatives to come on board?
Well, that's the live question. I think the government hasn't conceded on it enough to save itself from several defeats today. Look at the modern slavery amendment that they haven't accepted. Theresa May and Ian Duncan-Smith, former Tory leaders, both are probably going to oppose the government on that for that reason. The problem for the government is the more draconian their immigration policies get, the likely they are to be snarled up in the courts and the House of Lords. But equally, the longer they are seen not to be solving the very visible and visceral problem of boats landing on the south coast, the more draconian they're likely to get. So this sort of feedback loop of, policy that's then stymied by the courts and the laws is likely to continue.
I just want to put it to John, was it wise for Rishi Sunak to make it a pledge, not just to reduce the numbers coming, they're going in the wrong direction, to stop the boats?
Well, we'll see in due course.
You believe that he can do that?
We'll have to wait and see the outcome of the policy.
Seems to be happening right now, and that's because this is an utterly failed government policy. So,
well, hang on, it hasn't actually happened, this government policy. How do you know it's failed?
Well, I know it's failed because we're supposed to be learning that from the introduction of this bill, it's supposed to be acting as a deterrent, and I don't think there's any sense that it will be doing that. What it will be doing is making people's lives so much worse. What it will be doing is not only being unworkable, as Emma said, but I think it's illegal, I think it's immoral, I think it's an abhorrent piece of legislation.
If the boats were stopped, would that not be a moral thing to do?
They are not going to get stopped because people only are getting into those boats because the situation they are leaving is worse than the risk that they might take taking those boats. And we know that because so many journalists have actually been talking to those journalists out there. What we need are safe and legal routes.
Hang on, don't talk over each other. Now, John, you start.
No, just say it's unfair to say that somebody in France is leaving a country that's worse than the United Kingdom, because quite clearly
everybody to stay in France.
No,
is that your policy? Because that is the logic of what you're saying. That if they're not allowed to cross the water, they're going to be in France.
The first safe country you come to, you should be claiming asylum.
It's illegal
and
and
on
it's
that
immoral.
note of disagreement, that's all we have time for today. But thank you to all of my guests, and I'll be back with Prime Minister's questions here on Politics Live at 11:15 tomorrow. Please join me. Bye-bye.